Hello, good day, good evening, and welcome to WithSecure's supply chain webinar series, How to Tackle Vulnerabilities in Your Supply Chain. WithSecure has extensive history working with organizations securing their infrastructure and systems from cyber attacks, recovering from incidents, as well as keeping tabs on the current threat landscape and figuring out what is actually lying out there waiting for us online. With me today, I have Jarno Niemelä, Principal Researcher, WithSecure Intelligence. He has worked with WithSecure in the past 22 years, and WithSecure, formerly F-Secure Labs, of course. You've been working on analyzing and identifying malicious behavior and planning automatic malware handling systems. And today, you're automating cyber attack detection and planning new cyber defense systems for WithSecure and for WithSecure products and services. And with Jarno, we have also Mohammed Kasem Hassan Nejad, and you joined WithSecure 4 years ago, and you work or you focus on threat analysis, intelligence, and detection engineering. And my name is Laura Kankala, and I work as a senior security consultant at WithSecure. So today, supply chain. What do we mean with supply chain? Kasem.
Thanks for asking, Laura. So I think to understand supply chain, we have to look at what an organization needs to achieve their business outcomes. So a company usually has a supply chain network that consists of all the resources and services that they need to procure in order to achieve their business outcomes. And that can range from software components to hardware appliances to even productivity tools and office tools like project management software. But usually in our field, we usually look at the software supply chain. And it's in today's world, it's gotten pretty complex because of the interconnection and reliance on one another. So one supplier can actually be a supplier back, like there can be a bi-directional relationship between suppliers. And this makes it a pretty complex web of supply chain networks. And with this, of course, comes the potential threats that this poses because of this interconnection and third-party reliance on one another in today's world.
Exactly. So when we have these interconnected systems, what do, in your opinion, Jarno, the supply chain attacks actually mean?
Well, basically, supply chain attack is an indirect form of attack into some kind of target or group of targets. It can be because the actual target of the attacker is well defended and going through a supplier, software component, tampering with the printer in mail, or anything else is the easiest path, the path of least resistance to getting on the target organization. Or then the attacker is looking for easy mass distribution. So if they are able to get into certain software supplier that has 10,000 interesting customers or several millions to tens of millions of customers globally, being able to infect a component that is supplied then to all of those customers gives an enormous leverage for the attacker.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's kind of a force multiplier.
Yeah. So why attack one when you can attack multiple? But then a question for both of you. But who are actually victims, or who can fall victim to a supply chain attack? And now we're talking about organizations, companies, and bigger communities. So who are the victims for these types of attacks, Jarno?
Well, there's of course the high-profile targets, Fortune 500 companies, and other very important targets from business-wise. Or then it can be smaller companies that are actually don't think themselves to be necessarily that interesting, but they have something that is of value, be that scientific value, medical research, etc. For example, in Finland, we have a company called Vaisala. They make high-end sensors. but those sensors are needed for many critical applications and they cannot really easily be replicated. So thus it's a very interesting target. Or then the other option is that, as mentioned, it can be that a certain company is a supplier for a very difficult target and the attacker thinks that going through this target is the path of least resistance.
Yeah,
Or then the mass effect that was mentioned before.
absolutely. Because do you think anyone is safe from supply chain attacks?
No, I think every organization these days is part of at least one supply chain. And because of this interconnection and this complexity that it provides, like Jarno mentioned, sometimes an organization, even a small business, can become a stepping stone. But I think just like how an organization, there are critical assets that in a network that a company wants to protect, like their domain controller server or their code signing servers. There are also certain suppliers that are part of a considerable number of these supply chain networks or part of critical supply chains that contain high-value targets. But again, anyone can be a target because we cannot neglect even the smaller businesses because in some scenarios they might be, like Jarno mentioned, the path of least resistance.
Yeah, and if we think about the attackers, they come with different motives. For some it may be money. It may be gaining access to some specific systems for espionage. So if we try to sum up, who are behind these types of supply chain attacks? So who would you say are doing this or leveraging basically this interconnected world and systems that we live in?
I think with traditional supply chain, we usually look at supply chain attacks as something sophisticated, and the first group of threat actors that come to mind are either nation-state actors or state-sponsored actors. But I think depending on the class and the objectives of the supply chain attack, the threat actor can differ. I think I sometimes think of it like with this analogy that any criminal can enter a bank, but not every criminal can pull off a bank heist. And then we have small bank heists and we have big bank heists. So for nation-state actors, usually they're after espionage, sabotage, or intellectual property theft. And they're the most well-resourced and knowledgeable entities, so they can pull off these sophisticated attacks. But they're not the only actors that would leverage a supply chain attack to achieve their outcome. But they probably would usually use different classes of supply chain attacks, going from physical hardware, software, and even service-level supply chain attacks to target usually the type of targets that has some sort of interest for the state. So intergovernmental or governmental agencies and institutions, companies and organizations that are part of high value or strategic sectors like telecommunication, energy, defense, technology, or any critical infrastructure. But then, of course, there are cybercrime gangs and still small-time actors.
Yeah. You talked a lot about espionage, so the intelligence that they can gather. But what about cybercrime gangs and what's their interest in supply chain security or not security, attacking supply chain?
They are opportunists. So for criminal, first of all, they need to find out a way to hit the target. And once they find out a way to hit the target, then they monetize it. So it means that either some gang has figured out an opportunity to perform a supply chain attack, or somebody has done a discovery and sold the information for them. So I don't think we are going to see anytime soon any cybercrime gang that would be specializing on supply chain attack. That's not their mode of operation. Some gang found an opportunity and they are leveraging it.
Yeah, and cyber gangs, they typically operate in these affiliate networks. They have people they can buy this information and exploits from. So that's important to understand that there are many types of threat actors behind this, but essentially supply chain can be sometimes the easiest way in then. But if we think about supply chain, well, one obvious part of internet and systems and services we use is, of course, the software that we are running on them. So if we start with talking about development and development as part of the supply chain. So Jarno, would you want to share some thoughts? And we have some examples here about, for example, poisoned packages for different software components, or where you can download software components from, or then phishing for credentials and things like this. So what do you think is in common with these?
Well, there basically are three different types as they have been outlined here. First of all is that it depends whether the attacker is trying to hit the organization or whether attacker is trying to gain access to the organization's customers through the organization. And in this case, the software development would be just the door of entry. But if you're talking about the software libraries with malware, they basically are two different use cases for that. Either attacker creates basically a counterfeit software library, which is a copy of original software library, and then adds malicious payload on it and creates a copycat name that is very similar, relying on carelessness or, and for example, using Google searches and Google advertising or something else, search engine optimization, to people to get to install the package of their name and not the original name. And that way being able to get into the organizations. Or the other more targeted, which could be done by nation state, is that they have a certain target organization that they know is doing a lot of development. They have figured out that they have certain package, be it on Ruby, Python, or something else that has same name, that internal package not shared outside of the organization. So they are going to create a public package with the same name. And if the package manager is not done right, it will always favor the public one before the private. And that way they get their software installed. And what then happens depends very much on the target. It can be installing a backdoor, basically gaining access. It can be stealing the developer's cloud or some other credentials, so basically a credential theft. Or then trying to modify build configurations or something else. So there's many different things. But the point in here is getting an access through fooling or either package manager or the developer to install a wrong library.
Yeah.
The other way is then that attacker actually obtains an access to certain legitimate software package. For example, by finding a username and password on some previous breach that has happened, or then basically doing a phishing attack, or otherwise compromising some developer's system and then being able to feed in malicious payload on a valid software repository. So the difference here is that now the library is exactly the correct one. It just has been tampered with at the source. While then with counterfeit, it's of course is not exactly the same library. And then the third one, which is actually rather interesting, is using money. So there have been cases where the attackers have been purchasing software projects of which somebody is about to give up, or just giving them enough money. There have been cases where Chrome plugins have been bought and been used to distribute either adware or malware. Mostly these kind of things have been, for some curious reason, Chrome extension plugins. So attacker finds some kind of an extension, contacts the developer and offers to buy them. And then the developer sees enough money and maybe suspects something, maybe doesn't, but anyway sells the access to that repository.
Yeah, perhaps doesn't have any interest in maintaining it anymore. And
yes, That happens with open source. So many times it can be that a very critical component is thanklessly being maintained by somebody for 10 years, and they kind of would like to get rid of it.
Yeah. And that's what lays the ground foundations for our modern society. Kasem, do you have anything you want to add here?
I think I agree with Jarno's points, and I think that these type of attacks, especially the ones that rely on the open source ecosystem, they generally tend to be used by either small-time threat actors or the cybercrime gangs. And the reason for that is the sophistication in these don't require you to target a specific supplier and try to compromise them, which requires a much more methodical approach, especially because you can assume that still most suppliers have their own security and defense systems in place. And this sort of approach is, I believe, like Jarno mentioned, more about setting bait and hoping someone bites. And usually for nation-state actors, they are much more interested in covert operations because at the end of the day, they want to try to reach their target, leaving as minimal footprint as possible. And that level of sophistication, especially if it's related to the open source, it can be discovered potentially a lot quicker than some level of, for instance, planning and execution that a nation-state actor might do to compromise a supplier.
Yeah, and perhaps sometimes compromising a software library does not grant that easy access into a system. So perhaps this nation-state and other actors are using different types of means to get into systems. For example, just last year we got an example of Kaseya, which is a company providing IT services, especially monitoring and like maintaining your IT infrastructure related services. In April 1st, 2021, actually Dutch Institute for Vulnerability Disclosure warned Kaseya that they have multiple vulnerabilities in their system, but they didn't have enough time to patch all of them. And unfortunately, then a criminal group called Revil, so Russian-speaking private ransomware as a service operator, was able to take or leverage these vulnerabilities and gain access through their virtual system administrator. So this VSA component, which is used to remotely connect to services, there were authentication bypasses and certain types of vulnerabilities which allowed these threat actors to basically gain access to then remote services. And perhaps biggest one of the, or at least most visible one of the victims to fall to this attack was Coop through Visma. So Visma was actually affected, and through that grocery store chain called Coop, especially operating in Sweden and in the Nordics, got affected, had to close 800 stores because they could not basically have any cash register money flows going and things like that. So what's different with this compared to, for example, the previous examples that we were discussing? Kasem.
Yeah, I think, like Jarno mentioned, since this was actually done or claimed by a cybercrime gang, and here it's about, again, opportunity seeking, where a ransomware gang is usually interested in hitting as many victims as possible. And this case is a bit interesting, I think, because basically what happened was that MSPs that were using Kaseya's VSA on-prem servers were compromised through the exploitation of the vulnerabilities that at that time I believe Kaseya was working on fixing. And by gaining access to those systems, now they use the inherent trust that the clients of those managed service providers have to the client environments to actually infect the customers. Or so it's sort of like a multi-chain sort of compromise where the MSPs were used sort of as a stepping stone to get to a much larger target audience and deploy the ransomware both across the clients as well as the MSPs. And I think this case is sort of like the scenario where it sort of differentiates between, for example, a nation state actor and a cybercrime gang because they are financially motivated. It's more about seize the opportunity, hit big and hit fast, and utilize that trust that has been established in this sort of chain. Because the Kaseya services and the product and software runs as with high privileges on the client's environment because they are there's an inherent trust that they have to their managed service providers. And that sort of is one of the things that this highlights, that one of the problems with having sort of a blind trust in your supply chain.
Yeah. Exactly. And well, we have another example here of, it's a little bit different because you mentioned as well that this Rebel they are a cyber criminal gang. So they are not necessarily at least always working with government. They're based, like their motivations are based on money. So they want the kaching basically. But for SolarWinds, I'll just quickly go through this. So what was this? If I'm sure many of you online also read about this when this was happening, but actually this already came to light on December 2020, but last year was basically the year that this was being this was more on the news. And this started by a cybersecurity company called FireEye noticing that some of their hacking tooling, so red teaming tooling, had been stolen. And through that incident response process, they noticed that this attack originated from SolarWinds Orion software. And Orion software is this IT management software installed on their clients. And this is basically what kicked off this whole thing. But in the end, it turned out that there were victims such as most Fortune 500 companies, NATO, European Parliament, AstraZeneca, very different types of high-profile victims, basically, to this attack. What do you think about attacks like this, Jarno?
Well, this is very typical of a high-value supply chain target. So there are many different targets, and breaching and one critical point allowed access to so many multiple organizations. And as Kase mentioned, the trust is very integral part in here. For example, the FireEye and security company was not able to detect a breach in their own organization because it was done by trusted component, which is one of the things we were highly aware when we started developing our own attack detection systems. Some people sometimes laugh at us a bit because we are so paranoid that we don't even trust our own software. Which means that yes, we have false alarmed on WithSecure or previously F-Secure components, but there is method behind the madness. And that is not trusting even yourself. And that is probably the critical thing that separates many different organizations and many different security approaches.
Yeah.
Because the old style, antivirus style thinking is that you have clean software and you have trusted components.
Yeah.
While what you actually have is a set of trusted and known behaviors, and everything else is of suspect. So this basically outlines the whole thing, why these supply chain attacks are so damaging and why it is so important to have the right kind of thinking on the security mindset altogether.
Yeah, exactly. So trust is very dangerous in this domain. Kazem, do you have anything to add to this?
I think one other point to add on to Jarno's points, I think also this sort of differentiates between nation-state actor and cybercrime gangs and small-time actors, where the interesting part of this is the operational the OPSEC awareness and the methodical approach that the threat actor took, because it's not, like I mentioned, it's sort of any criminal can walk into a bank. Even a small-time actor could have by chance landed into the SolarWinds network, but in order to pull it off and remain sort of under the radar for long enough, because I believe this the initial compromise into the SolarWinds network was quite a bit before the first public report by Mandiant. Yeah, and that sort of differentiates between the how careful the nation state actors are, because they want to leave minimal footprint, and that could also be seen in the sophistication of the backdoor itself and how it was done. But of course, this is a high-profile attack, I believe, because of the targets as well as how it was pulled off. But this is sort of not something that all businesses all suppliers would sort of have to worry about. I think this is something that isn't really the common type of supply chain attack. This is the ideal or the most prolific one or high profile one.
Yeah, exactly. And like as you said, that this is, or now we've been talking about these cases, and I think it's good to understand how these things happen so that we can then discuss countermeasures. So in a couple of sentences, well, this is not probably something that you can answer in a couple of sentences, but Jarno, what would you say are the key takeaways and the most important things to consider when defending against supply chain attacks?
I already covered the thing that one has to lack trust, in a sense that it is very typical that when a software company takes a new library into use, the new library is audited and vetted, checked for legal, etc. before it's taken into use. And then it's going to be used blindly. While then, that kind of monitoring should be a continuous process, which of course means that one probably cannot afford the resources to do that, so thus it might be a good idea to look for a provider who can then audit the libraries and make sure that A, you are using the correct thing and not the counterfeit, and B, there hasn't been anything malicious slipped in. So basically, instead of once verifying and then trusting, it needs to be a constant vigilance. And that, of course, means that the processes need to be built so that it is financially feasible. Security is very easy to do wrong in a way that you are doing too much, and especially doing too much yourself. And that ends up in a situation where the security gets discarded altogether because it becomes a business risk.
Yeah, and there is the compromise of using, well, not compromise necessarily, but when we talk about supply chain security and perhaps not doing and reinventing the wheel for every application you do, it's not a good thing to do. It's not a good practice. Use modern technology. What about Kazem?
Yeah, I agree with Jarno. I think, for example, for software suppliers, like security has to sort of be baked into your software development lifecycle. You need to do threat modeling for the projects that you have, software projects that you have. But again, if you're unable to do that, then relying on an external team and knowing your suppliers, but again, not having a blind trust, because in the case of Kaseya or SolarWinds, for example, if I've seen this in the past with some of the customer engagements that I've had, where a customer just blindly does like a broad exclusion of like the software that they typically use, saying that like they do not, like if it causes a false alarm, they just want to silent that false alarm. But sometimes, at least in the case of Kaseya, for example, it's you want to have some sort of system in place that's able to detect the anomalies, but at the same time not blindly trust that whatever this software does is inherently safe, because not no like Jarno mentioned, even we cannot trust that our own software can always, whatever the process does, would be safe.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, everyone listening in, make sure to have, if you have any questions, make sure to write them down in the comment section and let us know. We'll talk a little bit about predictions, what we think will happen in the future, and then we'll go to your questions and try to answer those as well as possible. But if we think about future and a future of supply chain security or the threats, what do you think are the most prominent things that people should take into account? Kasem.
So I think the traditional supply chain attacks are definitely here to stay. I mean, things such as the SolarWinds and these high-profile attacks by nation-state actors are definitely here to stay, especially with today's complex and interconnected supply chain networks and the reliance on third-party suppliers. But I also think the explosion, especially in the past 5 to 10 years, in the open source ecosystem with package managers and software repositories, and the adaptation by majority of businesses that have, if you've seen in the past 10, 20 years, like the majority of businesses have moved away from closed off proprietary and in-house solutions to using components or libraries that are open source in their own systems. And also with the increase in the amount of small-time threat actors that are looking to make it big, I think that we're going to see or we're going to hear more about compromises that come from a open source ecosystem more commonly, but at the same time doesn't mean that they're going to be successful, but they're going to be more common than the big high-profile attacks, especially because they're easier also to pull off for a wider range of threat actors, and not just, for instance, nation-state or state-sponsored actors.
What about your thoughts and what's the big next thing that's going to happen?
Well, one of the benefits of getting old is starting to get a long-term view into things. And what I have learned is security erosion. So whenever there is a new threat that comes to people's attention, measures will be taken. And that threat will be of less concern because effort is put into managing it. Then fast forward 5 to 10 years, and then people will forget. The people who were dealing with that problem before have either changed companies or have been promoted so high that they have no effect on day-to-day business on the level that where the vigilance was needed, and then we are going to see this again.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the dynamic nature of the open source economy is one of its biggest downfalls when it comes to this. New languages are coming up, and then shortcuts are constantly being taken. So I would say that probably, as Kasem mentioned, the open source is going to be a very significant vector. But my guess is that what we are going to see is bundled software. That used to be the big source of supply chain attack 5-7 years ago.
What do you mean with bundled software?
Everything that comes with your laptop, with the operating, especially on Windows laptops, even corporate laptops, there's all kinds of supplementary software that come with it, which all have their own self-update systems. And what has happened before was that there were multiple different cases where those windows of those softwares were breached, and then their software was being used to distribute. CC Cleaner was an example. Then there was at least 1 or 2 different update softwares by the laptop vendors that were being used to distribute malicious payloads. That has not happened for a while because vigilance started. So now it's a waiting game until the defenders forget, and attackers will rediscover it. Not the same attackers, they have moved to something else, but new breed and new generation of attackers are going to discover the same mistakes that people forgot.
Yeah, maybe we also need to do a better job in passing on information that was discovered.
If the next generations would ever listen, that is. We didn't.
Yeah, it's the rebellious nature. Thank you for your thoughts. And we are now ready to head into questions. We've actually gotten some good questions in the chat. And I would like to read this first one for you, and then you can decide whoever wants to answer to this. As a small business owner, how do I know how much security is enough to protect my company and our supply chain? How much security is perhaps hard to measure, but what would be the at least the minimum requirements and the minimum things that should be taken into account?
I have a partial answer for that, and that would be the things that can be mass-produced and taken into use with a relatively small cost, because of course the cost of security must not ever be a significant fraction of running your business. If it is, then you need to rethink your business model. So endpoint and detection and response, definitely, and preferably of the paranoid nature that doesn't even trust itself, because that's the best protection against supply chain attacks. And then of course good endpoint protection, because your company obviously doesn't want to be a stepping stone into your customers.
Yeah, I agree with Jarno that a good endpoint protection can help detect these malicious behavior, but at the same time having good IT policies and access controls. I mean, just the usual run-of-the-mill cybersecurity practices is usually a must. I mean, for example, if you have endpoint protection, that's not like a magical band-aid that will solve everything. But I think security is always about layering and having defense in depth. But like Jarno mentioned, sometimes it's not sensible for small businesses to really full on like have a cybersecurity strategy that's bigger than what they need. But a good starting point is endpoint protection, and I think just general IT policies in place, having the right sort of, for example, access controls to the to different assets in the company. And that, I think, in an organization is usually the starting point. And from there, you can sort of build a cybersecurity strategy that supports your business and your business outcomes. And that's not debilitating. Like, it doesn't take away the ability of the employees to do their day-to-day work, because security has always sort of been seen as a trade-off of security and convenience. And I don't think it always has to be like that. And there can be a whole debate about that. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and as Jarno and Kasem said, like, just start from something and start building from there. You don't have to make security work overnight. It's a continuous process, and there's no clear goal for any size of business, actually. Then we have a couple of more questions. I think we have time to answer both of them. So how can I tell when a third-party app on my laptop, which I have trusted before, has become compromised?
For that, the endpoint detection and response is the crucial point. Because when it looks the application as a set of known and allowed behaviors, it will alert on potentially suspicious behavior, no matter how long the software has been there. In fact, if the fact that totally new behavior occurs that hasn't occurred before even makes it even more suspicious.
Yeah.
So the thing is that you need software that is not built like an old-fashioned antivirus. And this comes from old-fashioned antivirus researcher. Everybody's got to learn that the world has changed. So nowadays it's a set of behaviors. And then the problem is that this doesn't really show on any kind of product reviews.
Yeah.
So it is just asking questions and hoping that the sales engineer actually knows what they are selling.
Yeah, and then next question to you, Kasem. So the most prominent platform for the next major attack is one of the widely used remote management tools or platforms like Kaseya, or the larger the user base of the said tool, the more prominent it is. So perhaps this is the question. So is the next prominent attack one of the widely used remote management tools or platforms? Sorry, perhaps I don't quite understand this. Like Kaseya.
Or the remote management
is it,
or administration software
Sorry
providers.
to the person who asked this question, but
The next.
Yeah. So how I would understand this is that is the next attack going to be something like Kaseya, or is it going to be something else?
I mean, I think it's hard to predict, because again, supply chain attacks can happen, but it also depends, like the next big one. Usually things like the Kaseya attack, supply chain attack, are the ones that are considered big. But again, it's hard to predict whether that's really going to be the way in. But I think it comes down to the way that we have to sort of be vigilant and have and make not have blind trust for example, the sort of behavior that is usually done through these remote administration software, for example, because if a company like Jarno mentioned, usually how EDR, for example, would be beneficial here is that if a remote administration software starts acting erratically, or it starts doing something that's considered anomalous, that is not part of the routine behavior, then that's where it could be picked up. But again, I think it's really the question is hard to answer with whether it's not like a yes or no, because again, supply chain attacks come in all shapes, flavors, and forms, but I think the more we're gonna hear more about at least the supply chain attacks that started or are from the open source ecosystem, at least hear about them more commonly, even if they're not prolific.
Yeah.
My personal guess is backup software. They're ubiquitous, they are everywhere, nobody pays attention to them. And they already have the accepted behavior of accessing every single file. What would be the better alternative? And I really hope I didn't give any attackers ideas.
Yes, all attackers, close your ears. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like remote administrator. It can be backup. It can be any basically client software that has wide access rights to the specific platform, server, workstation, whichever it is. All right. I want to thank you all for coming and listening to this webinar series, How to Tackle Vulnerabilities in Supply Chain. Thank you, Jarno. Thank you, Kasem, for the interesting discussion. We would like to now wish you good night, good evening, or whichever time zone you're in. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.